Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine, the podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at B5VSDS9. We're available on all major and most minor podcatchers. Please like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. If you have a question about either show or anything else you'd like us to tackle, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcatcher. Take a screenshot and email the screenshot and your question to us at b5bsds9@gmail.com, and we will answer your question live on the show. We plan to start a Patreon with bonus content in the near future, so if you have any ideas of stuff you'd like to see for bonus episodes, please hit us up again at email at b5bsds9@gmail.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Babylon 5 versus Deep Space Nine. This is Bob from Cascadia. I got Matt from the Southland on the line. How you doing today, Matt?
I'm feeling a little better. I guess it's kind of ironic that one of today's episode is infection, because I think I would rather have the infection that the character gets in this week's episode than the infection I have now.
Well, it's good to know that steroids work, kids. Matt's been roiding and he's feeling a lot better, so that's an important lesson for us all. So today we're covering the Babylon 5 season 1 episode 4 Infection, which premiered on the 18th of February in 1994. And then we're going to look at the Deep Space Nine Season 1, Episode 11, Nagus, which appeared on the 21st of March, 1993. Matt, do you want to kick us off with the A and B plot from Infection?
Sure, yeah. Dr. Franklin's mentor, Dr. Hendricks, smuggles biotech artifacts from the extinct Ikaran civilization, which wind up threatening the station. Commander Sinclair ducks the INN reporter Marianne Kramer, who has an interview scheduled with him, to commemorate the station to find the odds in surviving to its second anniversary. So two very significant plots going on throughout this, but the A plot does, of course, dominate. They got very Borg-like impressions from this biotech artifact that turns one of the characters into, essentially to me, it looked just like a Borg.
Yeah, there's a little bit of there's definitely a lot of the Borg going on there, although in some ways it's maybe more of like a Star Trek the original series, like rogue artificial intelligence plot, where like the computer takes its programming too literally and gets out of control and destroys civilization or oppresses civilization.
He was seeking anything that was impure. Like that felt like a very, that was its programming, that it was seeking things that were impure, and defining what an impurity was basically impossible. So that's pretty much how Sinclair at the end is to overcome the problem there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd also say the design sort of reminds me of the design of the Nelson who gets infected by the extinct Ikaran civilization's artifacts. It sort of reminds me on the one hand of like the Phalanx from the X-Men comics. I was just reading the Phalanx Covenant from the mid-90s. And they often get talked about as like the X-Men's Borg, but it's like this techno-organic virus, like infects people and creates this collective intelligence. And the collective intelligence is made up of a lot of anti-mutant human bigots. And so, these bigots, as this sort of phalanx collective intelligence, are trying to wipe out mutants. And yeah, there felt like a lot of similarities. I think this episode predates the Phalanx Covenant by like 2 years, or at least a year. So maybe there was some residual influence on that X-Men storyline. And then Also, like you make the point of the similarity to the Borg. I think with like the blaster arm, there's also maybe a little bit of similarity to the Marvel Comics villain Claw, who I think is kind of famous for his relation to Black Panther now.
Yeah, I've got to give props to the costuming department on this particular episode with the way that that character looks. He slowly becomes this. He slowly goes from being human to machine, and there's different stages of that, and they did a great job showing that transition from human to basically a machine being, and it just looks great, honestly, in my opinion. He doesn't look like a Power Ranger villain like a lot of times his kind of characters end up looking like.
Mm.
But he doesn't look like a complete copy of the Borg either. It was almost more like a horror movie villain, in my opinion, just some kind of like biomechanical. Yeah, I was impressed with what the design. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Or were you more put off with it?
Um, I don't know if I was impressed by you, but I wasn't put off by it. And I mean, I think
Right.
specifically like the texture on Nelson's skin in like the early stages of when the artifacts are taking him over, that looked, I mean, that was really off-putting, but like in a really good way, like the image of like skin and metal melding together in the early stages of the infection were I thought really affecting.
And like you said before, there's always something about a gun arm that just makes it better. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of visual similarity, but the sort of sense of like the unstoppable machine also gave it a big Terminator and Terminator 2 energy, of course.
Being on the hunt.
Yeah, yeah, and from out of the past instead of out of the future. Two other pop culture connections I wanted to stress. One is in the B plot, we have Garibaldi telling the reporter Kramer how he met Commander Sinclair in a desert. And I think a year or so later, DC Comics did an 11 issue Babylon 5 series. And in the second story arc of that series, it's called Shadows Past and Present. They flesh out how Garibaldi and Sinclair first met in that desert. It's a real bad comic. It's not good. The first story arc is pretty interesting, and we might even do like a side episode on it when we get to its point in chronology. But the second arc of the comic that fleshes out Garibaldi and Sinclair's meeting, not great, not great.
It's not even worth pirating.
I would say no. I mean, it's better than the
Wow.
it's better than the third arc, which is even worse, and doesn't have any mythos significance. But the first arc is worth reading, and actually did get put out as a trade paperback called The Price of Peace. So we'll probably cover that, and then there's there was the first ongoing series that did 11 issues, and then there was a mini series later that did 4 or 5 issues. And I haven't read the mini series because I think it doesn't. I think it's not in continuity until like the fourth season of the show, maybe. But who knows? Maybe that second mini series is good.
Yeah, I'm surprised DC put that out. That sounds so much more Marvel to me, like them using those tie-ins with TV shows.
Well, I think at the time, DC might still have had the Star Trek license. I mean, certainly they had the Star Trek license for most of the 80s. So even though I think we more associate Marvel with movie adaptation comics and with like tie-in comics like Transformers and GI Joes, I think it really was there was a strong association between DC and Star Trek, and I think getting the Babylon 5 license was maybe kind of tying into that vibe.
One thing I like was the inclusion of Dr. Vance Hendricks, who is actually played by David McCallum. It caught my eye at first. I was like, I know that guy. Where do I know him from? And I remember you had introduced me to Sapphire and Steel a couple of months ago.
Yeah, that was the second pop culture connection, and it's a really great English show from like 1979 to 1982. I think it ran for 4 seasons or 4 series, as the English say. And it's a kind of hard show to describe. It's got a little bit of old Doctor Who serial energy to it, if you're familiar with old Doctor Who serial energy, but it's basically about these two alien investigators named Sapphire and Steel. and they investigate hauntings and disturbances of time. And it has that sort of British serial format where episodes are about 30 minutes long, and you'll have 4 or 6 30-minute episodes form one storyline. And there's just in some ways it's very slow paced and maybe a bit of a challenge for a modern audience, but there's a lot of really interesting like electronic sound design going on with both the soundtrack and the theme music. It's also interesting because Sapphire and Steel, the two main characters, and David McCallum plays Steel, are really fairly cold-blooded. It's not exactly clear what they are, but they seem to be some sort of alien, and they seem to have a very kind of paternal and detached relationship to the humans they're helping. And it's also just a really interesting way of like doing haunting stories, but in a very sort of modernist like science fictional context, like because they're looking at things that you could call like poltergeist or possessions, but it's always framed as like a temporal disturbance. And so it really gets the feeling of the eerie or the uncanny. The sci-fi critic Mark Fisher has written about the show in that regard, and it really gets those feelings, but it does it in a kind of unfamiliar SF context. And the finale of the show is particularly pretty haunting and pretty dark, and I think it was a really big influence on both the finale and other parts of Twin Peaks season 3, The Return from 2017.
I've watched the first series, like you said, and I will say it's very dark. It's very going into the unknown. I like that part of it. It's different. The other characters that are introduced just make it are way interesting. So if I definitely recommend it if you're interested in, I guess, British TV from that era.
Yeah, like they introduce some other alien agents who also have mineral names. So like lead is one. I he Led's one of the most charismatic, and then there's another really charismatic guy, but I'm blanking on his name. But yeah, having the new agents are really interesting when you get to those, and Sapphire and Steel. And then the other thing that just has to be stressed is how extremely low budget it is. It's very low budget, late 70s English TV. That's a big similarity it has with early Doctor Who. So that ought to be stressed too.
Going back to Babylon 5, talking about the organic technology. At one point, it's mentioned that the Vorlons. This is the first time the Vorlons are mentioned in a couple episodes, but they actually possibly have this technology to their advantage. I don't know if you caught that.
Oh, I didn't catch that. Although I think I was like getting up to grab a glass of water when that line was said.
Uh,
But that's a plot thread that is going to keep getting pulled on, although not for a long time necessarily.
okay, yeah, that sounds real scary though. Like if they have that kind of technology and can utilize it. Anytime they mention the Vorlons, I have to like write it down because I have to know like what's their deal. Like I'm just trying to piece it together.
Yeah, you might wind up a little surprised because last time I told you that at the point where I was at, we still knew nothing about the Vorlons, and I'm watching ahead a little bit, and I know a little bit more, not a lot, but a little bit more, and you might be kind of surprised at like the direction and the tone it goes. So I'm really looking forward to us getting there and seeing what you think of it, especially given your initial revulsion to Ambassador Kosh and his encounter suit.
Yeah. Speaking of suits, this is the first time the Babylon 5 crew, they put on these armor suits. They're like solid black. Did you see that?
Is that when they're going to try and fight the thing, like when Garibaldi's leading
Yes.
him?
Yeah, they put on these like leather armor suits, and I was like, that is so nice. That's like the most 90s thing ever. It reminded me of like the X-Men movies and just how that like leather armor was the thing up until probably the middle, probably pre 2005 is when they stopped doing that. But like leather armor was the thing back then.
Yeah, because it's interesting you bring up the X-Men again because the switch from like spandex and latex to leather didn't really happen for the X-Men until the late 90s, when you had the kind of 1-2 punch of the movies and Grant Morrison taking over the X-Men and kind of abandoning the traditional costumes. Although
Right.
that only stuck for maybe 3 years before Joss Whedon came back and ruined everything. Um, one other, and this is kind of a big point, but I'll try to be swift and precise with it, is I really like the layers of like irony about time and history in this episode. It actually, even though I'd seen it a couple times, like thinking in depth about this really kind of impressed me. I thought the writing was pretty good because we have this scenario where Dr. Vance Hendricks is a university archaeologist and he gets frustrated at the lack of government and university funding for planetary expeditions. So he quits academia, he goes to shady corporations for funding, and he attempts to do like these mercenary expeditions to scavenge old alien technology and old alien weapons from dead worlds that he can then sell back to the corporations. And the hope is he'll eventually hit a payload and be able to finance his future research expeditions without the corporate sponsorship. And so we see Dr. Franklin being really off put by his old mentor doing this. And so the way that Hendricks overcomes Dr. Franklin's unease is partially through lying to him. He doesn't tell him that like they broke quarantine with the materials, but he also kind of appeals to Franklin's little bit egocentric desire to go down in history as like one of the great scientists with a great discovery. And so it's kind of ironic that on the one hand, like Hendricks is looting these dead worlds, these extinct civilizations that can no longer give an account of themselves. But on the other hand, he's like using the idea of like an ongoing history to push Franklin into doing something that's morally dubious. Did you have any thoughts about that, Matt?
Honestly, Bob, no, that was a youth thing.
That was amazing. Well, and then it's kind of interesting because that also picks up in the B plot, because at the end, you have the reporter Kramer is given this pretty heated interview with Sinclair, and she's kind of echoing these Earth First talking points. And Sinclair gets really impassioned, and he's making the argument that like humanity must go in space to escape the eventual destruction of Earth and to preserve all of Earth's achievements like Marilyn Monroe and LOSA and Buddy Holly. And so it's sort of interesting that like what Sinclair is worried about is like sort of centered in the episode. In we have the Akaran civilization that's gone extinct, and we even make the connection tighter because in a different scene at the end of the episode, you have Franklin and Ivana Nova in our latest latest installment of Deep State Watch. They're really concerned that Earth Force is confiscating all of these biotech weapons from the Akarans, and they're kind of worried that the xenophobia and the aggressive militarism that killed the Akaran civilization may infect Earth too. So it's sort of interesting that you keep hitting these different pegs about time and about preserving culture, but also about being afraid about people who are too militant or too xenophobic in their preservation of culture. So I don't know. I just really like the dynamics that this episode was playing through. Another question I had for you, Matt, have you noticed the kind of weird rhythm of how Babylon 5 episodes end compared to the Star Trek episodes generally and Deep Space Nine episodes particularly?
Yeah, I really have. Like, honestly, with Deep Space Nine, the episode, whatever, it reaches the climax. Then you have like maybe a minute or two after that, and then you hit the credits.
Yeah,
with Babylon
like
5, there's like 15 more minutes of them going over different things that have happened and like the outcomes and what. Like, it's a different setup than what I'm used to seeing.
Yeah, and I think usually it's maybe we can kind of track this as we keep going, and maybe I'm wrong, but in my sense, it's usually just like you have the climax and the resolution of the main conflict, and then Babylon 5 usually has one kind of extended scene after that might go on for like as much as 5 minutes. But this episode was in particular just a really interesting example of that tendency, because you resolve the conflict with Nelson possessed by the Akaran bioweapons and that the sort of big action moments And then you literally have four different kind of decompression or character development or wrapping up scenes that, like, in any other show you could imagine like any one of these four just being the last scene and you go out. So you have Franklin turning Dr. Hendricks over to the security forces. You have Garibaldi confronting Sinclair about all the risk he's taking in the violent confrontations, not only in this episode but in the two prior ones of The Gathering and Soul Hunter. The third scene you have is Franklin and Ivanova dejectedly watching Earth Force confiscate the Ikaran artifacts. And then the final scene is that interview I was talking about where Kramer and Sinclair are conducting an interview and Sinclair gives this impassioned defense of humans in space. I don't know. Do you have other thoughts about that sort of formal tendency of the show or about those specific scenes, Matt?
I thinking that we were at the end of the show and then like, nope, there's more, and they just kept going with it. Whereas, like I said, with Deep Space Nine, they will just like it'll be the climax, and Cisco will say something, then they'll cut to that outro and the full shot of DS9, and then that's the end. Whereas I've noticed with Babylon 5, yeah, they really expanded, but I feel like it builds the unit, it builds the universe in a sense. I think that's what's a big piece of this, is that having these different, making sure that they kind of tie up a lot of the loose ends so that, they're world building in a sense. Whereas I think with Star Trek, you already have a lot of that in place.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I think I more took it as they tend to use, and I haven't kept a tally of this, so I might be wrong, but I took it as they tend to use these like post-climax scenes more for character development and thematic development, world building. But certainly in this episode, you're right that they're really doing it, a lot of it for world building, especially the third scene with Earth Force getting the Ikaran artifacts. So that is an interesting point, and it is something that like Babylon 5 had to do as an original series that like an established like Star Trek or Star Wars franchise wouldn't necessarily have to do. Another thing I would say is, even though I kind of like the end scenes, that it gives you a more meditative quality, in a way it maybe seems a poor fit for the era of streaming, because the era of streaming is all about binging and is all about immediately going to the next thing, right? Like you resolve the main conflict and it's like, okay, I want to see the next main conflict. So it can kind of feel a little weird. I mean, obviously I don't think one should let this feeling rule you, but like you kind of have this feeling when it's like, okay, the main point of the episode is over, but there's still 5 minutes, and it's just like, to me, in like the streaming mindset of watching something on HBO Max or Netflix, you kind of want to immediately go to the next thing, where you could see how build out from the climax would maybe be a lot more welcome in like this sort of serialized environment of weekly television, where you get your 45 minutes of Babylon 5 per week, and that's it.
You want to move into DS9 a little with Nagus?
Yeah, we'll probably be a little swifter on Nagus than we were on Infection. So we've got two major plots in Nagus, which is also sort of a milestone in being kind of the first Ferengi-focused episode of DS9. We'll tend to do one or two of those per season. And so in the A plot, Grand Nagus Zek, the leader of the Ferengi Alliance, has arrived at Quark's Bar to host a conference on Ferengi commercial strategies for the Gamma Quadrant. And it turns out to name a successor to head the effort of Ferengi commercial conquest of the Gamma Quadrant. And then in the B plot, Ben Sisko is worried about his son Jake's close friendship with Quark's nephew Nog. And I would also say in a C plot, Chief O'Brien is the substitute teacher for Jake and Nog's class because his wife is on a 2+, not just 2 weeks, but 2+ week family vacation during the school year, which as teachers, I think we can both say, what the hell, truly Star Trek is a utopia.
Yeah, that's insane. And the fact that they didn't have to find like they just got the chief engineer to go be the substitute teacher, which is weird in my opinion. Like, I don't know, did he have nothing else to do?
I don't know. Whenever I can't teach one of my classes, I just get my girlfriend, if I have one at the time, to teach it for me. Especially for 2 weeks at a time.
Yeah, wow, that's impressive. Yeah, I was surprised by that as well. Yeah, overall, I enjoyed this episode. I think it really started to paint the Ferengi, really actually define the Ferengi better than what the Next Generation did. I don't know if you remember that when the Ferengi were introduced in the Next Generation, they were just basically laughing hyenas with
Hmm.
bull whips and stuff, and it wasn't the intent. The way they're portrayed as now, this really paints them as a different species.
Yeah, like the sort of commercial and mercenary interest for the Ferengi were always there, but in my memory, it wasn't played up that much in the Next Generation. And also in the Next Generation, they did kind of play them up as like a military threat, with those starships that would occasionally get in confrontations with the Enterprise D. Whereas in Deep Space Nine, that the idea of the Ferengi as a military threat is totally gone, and you just
Yeah,
all
I think the Next Generation screwed up pretty bad with the initial representation of the Ferengi, and then went for the militant route, and then that didn't work either. And now we have the Ferengi as they are on DS9, which is it's much more interesting to watch, at least from a viewer's perspective.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised because I didn't remember how much, and I don't know if this could I don't think it really does continue in future Ferengi episodes of Deep Space Nine, but I was surprised how much of like a crime family vibe there was in this episode. You have, I mean, a mild spoiler: Quark is appointed as the new Grand Nagus, so Zek can retire and enjoy a hedonistic lifestyle, and so you have these scenes of him, or these scenes of him like handing out concessions, handing out trade routes, and you also have a scene where he berates a petitioner that's tells him that he doesn't show him respect, and it's a very direct homage to that famous opening scene of the mafia movie The Godfather, where an undertaker comes kind of disingenuously to seek a favor from Marlon Brando, who's playing The Godfather. And it's kind of interesting that this sort of like generosity of Quark's style, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, because it seemed kind of not in keeping with Quark's personality or with general Ferengi cultural practices. I mean, we get introduced to the Ferengi rules of acquisition here, and number one is once you have their money, never give it back. And
Right.
I wasn't really sure what to make of the Quark's generosity as Nagus. I didn't know if it was just like it turns out Quark actually is unsuited for the job, and he's like really stressed and he just wants to get back to counting the bar receipts, or was it actually kind of a canny strategy, because it does seem to be upsetting the two Ferengi underlings who are plotting against him, because it's like, oh, he's getting popular with all these concessions.
Right. When
Yeah.
when Rom and the other Ferengi do point that out, that's a valid point. That they point out that that's not like how it's supposed to be done, and that if he does become popular, we're gonna have issues with how we go forward.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting, but yeah, it was a really fun episode. Famously, this is the great actor Wallace Shawn is playing Nagus, Zach, and he's a really great playwright too. I'll throw a mention in the show notes of he did a one man show, or actually he wrote it. It's a one woman show really, called The Fever, that I highly recommend. There's a good podcast version of it. I highly recommend people listen to it. And it's sort of ironic because in life, Wallace Shawn is well known as like a very militant socialist and Trotskyite. And here he's playing like the godfather of the ultra capitalist species. So that's kind of a funny joke to my
I
mind.
think Wallace Shawn is most well known for Princess Bride.
There was one other scene I kind of wanted to flag too. So there's a kind of common and kind of important trope in Afro American literature, where you have like a character either learning to read in their language or in a new language. And you can definitely see like the historical reasons for that, with like the denial of the outright criminalization of literacy among enslaved blacks in the antebellum US, and even with the continuing denial of educational opportunities after the war and after emancipation. you can see why that scene might have a lot of cultural resonance. But like if you read one of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, or if you read Richard Wright's autobiography, or if you read like Octavia Butler's science fiction novel Dawn, that scene of a Black character learning their language, or in the case of Dawn, an alien language, is always a really interesting kind of development moment for a character. And what I loved about this episode was it sort of reverses that, where Ben and Jake are two of the most prominent African American characters in all of TV science fiction. But here you sort of reverse that sort of famous trope of African American literature, where it's actually Quark's nephew, Nog, who doesn't know how to read. And so you have Jake secretly tutoring him against like the wishes of Quark and against the wishes of Rom and Nagus Zek. And you have Ben accidentally stumbling upon that and seeing that. I just thought that was a kind of really clever play on existing tropes of African American literature.
So let's talk comparisons. So as far as these two episodes, we'll start off with our thirst watch.
Yeah, who's thirsty on B5 or DS9 this week, Matt?
Yeah, on DS9 we've got Grand Nagus Zek. He basically, the moment he shows up on DS9, the first thing he wants to do is partake in all 5 of Quark's holo programs, which all sound very dirty and somewhat just to sound awful. So that was the first thing, and then of course he goes and they're waiting on him, and it's taking him forever to go through all the programs. And thankfully, they don't show anything going on the holodeck. But when he does come out, he's like extremely dehydrated and thirsty. So you can it's implied what happened while he was in there. I just thought that was gross, but whatever.
I mean, at least we don't see anything, and at least it's holographic women, not real women being harassed by the Nagus.
That's true. We may also want to start like an airlock watch, because it seems like one of the main ways that you can kill somebody or attempt to kill somebody in both of these television shows is by catching them in the airlock and trying to blow them out. You'll see this a lot. I don't know if that's what happens with Quark here, and then with the creature, the
Nelson turned into the Ikaran. Yeah,
right. That's what happens there as well. And then, but it happens again in the next. I think in the next couple episodes, you'll see it once again. Just it's a common trope of that's how we'll get rid of them. We'll suck them out the airlock.
Well, weirdly, the season 2 episode of Babylon 5 I watched last night has an extended monologue about somebody falling out of an airlock, and of course,
a common problem.
Yeah, of course, this would be perfected in Battlestar Galactica, right? Where the Secretary of Education, come president, her preferred method of executing the Cylons is airlocking them, which is you love to see a school teacher gone bad. You love it, folks. So we've also got a Deep State watch, which is, it was the 90s. Conspiracies abounded. The X-Files is one of the most popular shows on TV. And so we got to check in on what the Deep State is up to. Not too much on Deep Space Nine, unless you want to think about, the Ferengi Deep State instead of the Federation Deep State. So we definitely see Zek and the Ferengi Deep State up to some stuff. And then on Babylon 5, we have the Earth Alliance confiscation of Ikaran weapons, which seems to bode ill for the future. Yeah,
I didn't get much from Deep Space Nine as far as the Deep State watch, but I agree completely with the Earth Alliance confiscation of those weapons. That's going to be issues later on. I'm sure. You've watched further ahead than I have, but I'm sure that becomes a problem later on down the road.
I actually don't know if it literally will become a plot point, but I think it is setting up a concern about where the Earth Alliance is going that is going to be followed up on. But I'm not sure if the literal plot point of the Ikaran weapons are going to be followed up on, although it could be wrong. We've also got a racism watch, which so we've got actually a lot of prejudice on both stations in these episodes. So on Babylon 5, connected to the kind of concerns about the Earth government, we've got sense of this growing Earth first sentiment. And then on the DS9 station, we kind of have the mix of human and Bajoran prejudice against the Ferengi and Ferengi prejudice against humans. And Ben Sisko having to overcome his own sort of preconceived ideas about Ferengi and about Nog specifically are a big part of this episode. And then maybe our last segment, we could call it Corporate Watch. And, it was the 90s. We were all worried about corporate greed. And we definitely have quite a bit of corporate ruthlessness from both the company Interplanetary Expeditions that is funding Dr. Hendricks and Babylon 5. And of course, we have corporate ruthlessness from the Ferengi Alliance. We would expect no less.
Yeah, corporations were like, there's a ton of that. I think it's going to happen with Babylon 5 as we go forward. I don't see it as much with DS9, but yeah, with the corporate ruthlessness of the Ferengi Alliance, that's a huge deal. Let me say this though. There's one thing we did leave out. I don't even know if we want to call this a segment. I'm just going to call it Matt's intuition paid off, I guess. Garibaldi at the end of the episode finally points out what I've been saying all along, that Sinclair is always putting himself at the forefront of everything and is going to get himself killed. And Garibaldi finally calls him out on it. And that made me happy to know that I actually was able to catch on to that. Like, okay, why is Sinclair always, just putting himself on the line? Anybody could have gone after the creature, but no, he had to go himself. He just jumps down this rabbit hole at one point and goes off and puts himself in the airlock and is willing to have himself sucked out into space just to save the station. It's like he wants to die. And Garibaldi called him out on it. So I was happy to see that.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting that Garibaldi kind of directly ties it into Sinclair sort of having real anxieties about what happened to all of his all the people under his command in the Battle of the Line and the survivor's guilt. And it seems like on the one hand, it is this sort of sense that Garibaldi identifies that Sinclair just wants to find something he can sacrifice himself for. But on the other hand, it also seems like Sinclair just has this real strong protectiveness for everyone under his command. And so he's willing to undertake these extraordinary and possibly stupid acts of bravery in order to protect the people under his command, because he doesn't want a repeat of what happened on the line.
So we'll see. Maybe Sinclair will step back a little bit in the next couple episodes, but I highly doubt it. I'm sure will probably still try to be the action hero he wants to be.
I actually do think he does step back, but I might be wrong about that. We'll have to see. But my vague memory of season 1 is that I think we've had our quota of action plots for the moment, or at least action plots in this way. I mean, there'll definitely be more before the end of the season, but that's sort of my feeling.
But next week we'll be looking at episode 5 of Babylon 5, Parliament of Dreams. And we'll be comparing that to episode 13 of DS9, Battle Lines.
Yeah, and we'll just have to warn the good folks in the audience in advance that Battle Lines is not a great episode, although it is sort of important for overall storyline and character development on DS9. So that's why we're covering it. All right. Well, we hope everybody joins us next week. It's always a pleasure talking to you. This has been Bob from Cascadia. I had Matt from the Southland on the line, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks for listening.
And remember, you can follow us on Twitter at B5VSDS9. For show notes, subscribe to our Substack, b5vsds9.substack.com. We're available on all major and most minor podcatchers. Please like and subscribe on your podcatcher of choice. If you have a question about either show or anything else you'd like us to tackle, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or another podcatcher. Take a screenshot, email that screenshot to us with your question at b5vsds9@gmail.com, and we will answer your question on the show. We plan to start a Patreon with bonus content in the near future, so if you have any ideas of stuff you'd like to see for bonus episodes, email us at b5vsds9@gmail.com.